Pieter's reverence is more complex than most of the rest of the main cast. Actually, I think he might have the most complex form of reverence in the main cast, period. I don't know why I do this to myself. Hello. How are you? Today I'm continuing the process of introducing the main characters of my upcoming webcomic, The Reverent Silence. Last month I introduced the main protagonists, Nadia and Safia, so today I'm rounding out the main group of protagonists. Once again, I'm going two at a time, so if you're interested, make sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned to the end to see the finished character visuals and help me appease the algorithm gods. Please? But without further ado, here we go. The third member of the Blackfield Investigation Bureau's first company, and holder of exactly 2 of the first company's 10 brain cells, and my oldest character of these 4 disaster children, is Pyotr Strahovski. For those of you wondering if I named him after Australian actress Yvonne Strahovski, no, I didn't. I promise that was not intentional, although it is a very rare surname, and apparently only a handful of people have this surname. Either way, don't bully me, please. Anyway, when I say oldest character, I mean the oldest character that's existed out of all of the characters that I made for The Reverent Silence, since I created him in high school. In universe, however, he's 24, which makes him the second youngest of the main protagonists. But anyway, Pyotr, like Nadia, is from the nation of Vyatka, and the reason he's in Blackfield is because, to make a very long story short, he wanted to get out of Dodge. If you watched the first episode, you may recall I mentioned a military regiment made entirely of reverents called the Eagle Guard, which directly answers to the Vyatkan monarchy. In Vyatka, reverents are seen as a resource, fuel for the nation's advancement, and instruments to enact balance as the king sees fit. Once they turn 20, all reverents are conscripted into the Eagle Guard, which is overseen by the king and led by the crown prince. All of this stems from the belief that reverents are blessings from the 15 gods of the pantheon, but more on that another time. Pyotr and his older brother were acutely aware of the future looming over their heads, and just about every Vyatkan citizen knows about the Eagle Guard. I mean, in the land of balance, it's impossible not to hear of them at least once. Pyotr especially was deeply afraid of being separated from his family and the only life he'd ever known growing up in a small village in the south of Vyatka. But on the other hand, he feared what would happen to his family if he tried to game the system. Unfortunately for Pyotr, his reverence manifested at the age of 7, which is well below the average age for that to happen, and which also just made things that much worse. Pyotr spent his childhood keeping his reverence to himself, fearing what would happen if anyone outside of his family saw his magic at work. Things ultimately came to a head when his brother persuaded him to leave Vyatka with the logic that even if one of the brothers got caught up in the Eagle Guard, at least the other would have a shot at being free. For his brother, it was already too late, but Pyotr swore that he would find a way to free him one way or another. And practically the week after he turned 19, Pyotr boarded a ship heading for Rotir. He ended up in a quiet coastal town where he lived for 8 months. An old fisherman who lived in the town suggested that Pyotr go to Blackfield, telling him there would be better job opportunities for him there. Pyotr was skeptical, of course, but he ultimately went, which, to make a very long story short, is how he ended up with the Bureau. I know, not completely different from being in the Eagle Guard, but to him being in the Bureau gives him a lot more freedom, and he's more or less come to terms with his power since joining. If there was a designated, guys, I'm not sure if this is a good idea, member of a friend group or a group of characters, it would be Pyotr. While he's willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, he's also the more cautious one of the group. He's absolutely the more introverted one in the group, and for the most part he keeps to himself, sometimes to a fault. Generally, Pyotr is a very considerate, thoughtful, and warm-hearted person, but he's also not the kind of guy who takes to the sidelines during a sticky situation, and he will come to his friend's defense in a heartbeat. Pyotr's reverence is more complex than most of the rest of the main cast. Actually, I think he might have the most complex form of reverence in the main cast, period. I don't know why I do this to myself. His ambition and the one thing he wanted more than anything else as a child was to keep himself safe from prying eyes and to just disappear from view. But things didn't quite go in his favor. Pyotr can transport one object or person from one place to another, basically like teleportation, with the one exception being Pyotr himself. However, Pyotr can create shadow clones of himself made of his reverent energy to aid in escapes or other sticky situations. His abilities were loosely inspired by performance magic, specifically the ability to make things disappear. And as a matter of fact, I originally had this idea that Pyotr would be able to create little pocket dimensions to hide away in or disguise himself as any given object around him. Though I also toyed around with the idea of him creating illusions that look and feel real while being unable to change the appearance of any living thing. When I created Pyotr in early 2014, he was intended to be the main character for a very short-lived psychological, borderline supernatural murder mystery called The Garden of Monochrome Lilies, where he played the role of detective. Much like the title, the premise was a very throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks type of thing, which was unfortunately very typical for 16-year-old me. And back then, Pyotr's name was actually Pyotr Saiga. Don't judge me. I did eventually lose interest in that story, and Pyotr went to the back burner for 7 long years. I don't really remember how I ended up thinking of him when developing the main cast of The Reverent Silence, but I'm glad I did, because he fits much better in this story. Come to think of it, I may have just been plotting things out one day when my brain said, "Hey, do you remember that character you created for that one story you ever wrote?" Finally, my brain being useful for a change. Aside from taking inspiration from street magicians, I also had a formal, elegant, slight Victorian lean in mind for Pyotr's design. The original design of his coat was pretty different from his final one. I was vibing with it at first, but as time passed, I wasn't really feeling it so much anymore. And there were also a couple of logistics problems with the midsection part of his jacket, which was meant to be more form-fitting than the rest of the jacket. So I fixed that up and made a couple other changes to his overall design as well. But his waistcoat and the boots and the general concept of his design stayed the same. Pyotr is also part of a bird-like race, and his traits were based on the red-backed shrike. Even though he is also half-elf on his mother's side, it's his bird traits that are more noticeable, the bird tail included. Originally, I wasn't going to lean into the bird traits outside of the colors of his hair, which are meant to mirror the red-backed shrike, but I ultimately gave in to temptation. Pyotr has a close bond with many members of the Bureau, especially the first company. He credits Sofia for helping him find a reason to embrace who he is as a reverent, and for giving him a place to belong in the Bureau. And he's also good friends with Nadia and Lark, the latter of whom is the most recent addition to the first company. Something I always like to explore is how everyone kind of balances each other out, since their personalities are so different, while also finding several common points that they bonded over, particularly with Pyotr and Nadia, since both of their lives have been impacted in some way by the royal family of their homeland, and as I mentioned before, the threat of the Eagle Guard looming over their heads. Pyotr has an interesting character arc. Aside from keeping to his own vow to save his brother, he also, like his friends, has to deal with the shadow of his past when Dawnrise shows up, since the group's leader Marielle, who I'll be covering in the next part of this series, has a way of getting into people's heads like that. Very unpleasant woman, that one. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Pyotr's morals and his ability to stick to his word get called into question several times throughout the bulk of the first season, more on that another time, and his character arc comes to a head a little further down the line. Basically, he has to reckon with his past and the things that he perceives as the mistakes that he's made. And those two things, including his relationships with his friend and his brother, are all intrinsically tied to who he is. Grappling with unpleasant feelings and deep-seated regret that's been festering for years? Man, that's hot! Anyway, that's about everything I have to say about Pyotr. Let's move on to the last member of the main group. Moving on to the youngest member of the Blackfield Investigation Bureau's first company, the CEO of Be Gay Do Crime, without actually doing crime because that's illegal, Lark Galleon. Of everyone in the main cast, Lark probably has the most normal backstory. He certainly has had a calmer, less eventful upbringing than his peers, that is for sure. Born in Anba, the land of innovation, which was inspired by late period and Ptolemaic-era Egypt, Lark's family moved to Blackfield when he was about 2 years old. Lark is the oldest of 4 siblings and grew up helping his parents run the restaurant they had set up shortly after coming to Blackfield, whether that was keeping track of the food stocks or helping them catch fish, which was their specialty. When they turned 13, Lark discovered their reverence for the first time on what was otherwise a normal day at the restaurant. Lark's family was, needless to say, ecstatic, and they were more than happy to send him off to the Reverent Seminary of Rotier, where Lark graduated with honors. Right after graduation, Lark applied for a job with the Blackfield Investigation Bureau, and Sofia, who had already been head commissioner for quite some time, welcomed him with open arms. And since someone in the first company had already retired, taking on someone who had excelled in all their classes and who was eager and enthusiastic about some hands-on experience as a reverend with substantial combat experience was naturally the best course of action. In the early days of the Reverent Silence's development, Lark was going to be more of a stoic, aloof-type fellow, but that fell through for 2 reasons. 1, because it just wasn't sticking, and 2, because I realized I needed someone to round out the main cast. Nadia is very upbeat, optimistic, and dedicated to her line of work. Sofia is a serious, perfectionist individual with a lean towards sarcasm, and Pyotr is a calm, collected, and kind-hearted guy who cares about his friends and is willing to go to bat for them if necessary. Lark, on the other hand, is a confident, energetic kind of character. They're cheerful, charismatic, and very easygoing, and also tend to be more adventurous and thrill-seeking than their colleagues, who by comparison are more cautious in the face of potential danger. Not to say Lark doesn't analyze the situation beforehand, because they absolutely do analyze the situation first. They're not dumb. Especially when Dawnrise, the magical self-help group that the story's villains run, comes into town, Lark is pretty much the first person to sound the bell. He knows something is sus, but can't quite place his finger on it. Now for Lark's Reverence. Lark's Reverence is shockingly deceptive at a glance, largely because of how they choose to use it. Where some mistakenly think Lark's Reverence has to do with the manipulation of water, their reverence actually involves magnetism. They can control the metallic particles of any substance, including water, and can also change the polarity and magnetic force of those particles. Even though Lark can change the magnetic force of metallic particles and objects, he cannot change the shape or form of a metallic object. He can only make it levitate and float around as he wishes. I think at one point when I was brainstorming possibilities for what his reverence would be like, I actually did have the idea of just having him manipulate water, but then I branched out as I went. Either way though, his method of using his reverence ties in with his aesthetic and overall concept. Lark was the last protagonist to be added to the story. I originally had the idea to have 5 protagonists, but I felt that would be a little too much to handle in this specific context, and I want everyone in a particular group of characters to be able to carry their own weight, so I went with 4 instead. Lark is part of a race that's based on fish, sharks, whales, and other marine life. Originally, Lark had the traits of a spear-toothed shark, but I felt later on that this initial concept wasn't eye-catching enough? Hopefully I'm making sense. So a brief aside, for context, when designing a character, especially a main character, I want them to stand out in some way. And try as I might, Lark's old design just wasn't hitting that mark. So I took a look at other sea creatures that I thought would suit Lark while sticking to the cool color scheme that I had in mind for him. And lo and behold, I found the blue glaucus.
Look at these little muffins.
However, I do not recommend touching one directly without protection, as doing so can result in a painful sting. You have been warned. One thing that has stayed constant is Lark's design concept, which was a sort of pirate seafaring concept. Of course, I didn't lean all the way into the pirate concept, but hopefully I'm making sense. And funny enough, I have it in my production notes that his favorite hobby is sailing. In Lark's character sheet, I had his head fins be more detailed with more of the finger-like structures that you see on an actual blue glaucus or other nudibranch sea slugs. But I realized that this would, in the long run, be a massive pain to draw, so I ended up simplifying the head fins later on, and hopefully I can make those changes to his character sheet. If my brain lets me. Also, for anyone wondering about Lark's name, despite him being from a country inspired by Ptolemaic-era Egypt, his father is technically Irish, if that means anything. But anyway. As I briefly mentioned with Pyotr, it's interesting and also fun to write about the dynamic between the members of the first company. Lark is more or less the mood maker of the group, and definitely the most energetic one of the bunch. And as I said in the previous video in this series, the first company is a very tight-knit group, so they all look out for each other no matter the weather. Well, metaphorical weather. In regards to the Dawnrise situation, Lark is the first to notice something is up, and he constantly keeps an eye on the folks at Dawnrise. However, he also has to keep himself sane in the madness that is all of Dawnrise's workshops, as more and more people are swayed to the side of this so-called counseling group. And as the events of the story expand beyond Dawnrise, Lark is forced to call everything he has known about himself and his abilities as a reverent in the Blackfeld Investigation Bureau into question. And he also has to question his method of approaching every problem he has encountered prior to the Dawnrise situation, because this problem quickly goes from something localized into something that puts all of Blackfeld in jeopardy. Then again, everyone in the first company has to put their brain cells together to figure out how to stop the madness and keep Blackfeld from falling into complete chaos, but I think there's something to be said about how Lark goes about handling the situation. They're the youngest member of their company, and I think there's something to be said about how the actions of a very sketchy self-help group eat away at your naivete when you're young and mostly inexperienced in comparison to the rest of your peers. But I'll just leave it at that before I start rambling, and also before I go into spoiler territory. But that's going to do it for part 2 of this series. In the next part, we'll finally be getting to the villains, so if you like this video and you want to see that, make sure to like, subscribe, and also follow me on my social media accounts, and if you made it this far, comment with a bird emoji. Again, I need to appease the algorithm gods. Also, if you want to support me further, then please check out my Ko-fi as well as my Etsy shop, both of which are also in the description. Thanks for watching, and like last time, it's time to appreciate the finished character visuals.